In 1978, a Russian diplomat bought a house 3 miles from CIA headquarters. His neighbors thought he was a professor. They invited him to barbecues. They discussed Dostoevsky on his porch. They never suspected the camera hidden in his upstairs window. His name was Yuri Loginov. For 2 years, he photographed every car, every face, every pattern of movement at America's most sensitive intelligence facility. Moscow Center demanded results. The FBI was closing in. And then, his closest friend, a CIA analyst, asked him a question that shattered everything. But what happened next wasn't captured in any Soviet file or American report, because the greatest act of espionage Yuri Loginov ever committed wasn't against America. It was against the system that sent him there. And the choice he made in that quiet suburban garden would haunt both empires for decades. What do you do when the lie you're living becomes more real than the truth you were sent to protect? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing this community grow across the world. And if stories like this, the hidden truths behind the Cold War, the impossible choices, the quiet acts of conscience buried in classified files, if that's what you're here for, hit subscribe, because there are dozens more waiting to be told. Now, let's go back to Virginia. Spring 1978. A moving truck pulls up to a quiet street in McLean. The house was unremarkable. A modest colonial with white siding and black shutters, set back from the street behind a row of oak trees that had stood there since before the war. The front lawn needed mowing. The mailbox bore a simple name, Loginov. Inside the moving truck, furniture wrapped in blankets shifted as the driver turned off the engine. It was a Saturday morning in May, and the neighbors came out to watch. This was McLean, Virginia, a bedroom community where government workers raised their families in careful anonymity. Nobody asked too many questions here. Nobody advertised what they did for a living. The unspoken rule was simple. Mind your business, keep your lawn tidy, and maybe bring a casserole when someone new moves in. Mary Henderson from across the street was the first to approach with a plate of brownies. She found Yuri Loginov directing the movers in accented but fluent English, his wife Irina unpacking boxes in the kitchen, their 2 children exploring the backyard with the cautious excitement of kids in a new place. "Welcome to the neighborhood," Mary said, and Yuri smiled. A warm, slightly tired smile that made him seem instantly familiar. He explained that he taught Russian literature at a small college in Washington. His wife had been a translator before the children came. They'd moved from New York, looking for somewhere quieter, somewhere safe. Mary nodded knowingly. McLean was full of families seeking exactly that. Safety, normalcy, the American dream in its most modest form. What Mary Henderson didn't know, what none of the neighbors could possibly know, was that Yuri Nikolaevich Loginov was a KGB intelligence officer, trained at the Red Banner Institute in Moscow, inserted into American society with a cover identity so carefully constructed it had taken 3 years to build. Every detail of his life had been rehearsed. His university position was real, secured through a network of Soviet agents embedded in academic institutions. His publications on Chekhov were genuine scholarly work. His children attended local schools under their cover names, speaking English without a trace of Russian accent. Even his marriage to Irina, though arranged by the KGB for operational purposes, had evolved into something resembling genuine partnership. They had learned to play their roles so completely that the roles had become indistinguishable from reality. But the house itself, that unremarkable colonial on a quiet street, had been chosen for one reason only. From the second-floor window of the master bedroom, Yuri had a direct line of sight to the main entrance of CIA headquarters, just 3 miles away. With a telephoto lens and patience, he could photograph every vehicle entering and exiting the compound. He could note patterns, identify faces, track the rhythms of the world's most powerful intelligence agency, from the comfort of a suburban home where his neighbors waved to him each morning as they backed out of their driveways. Yuri Loginov had been born in Moscow in 1937, 2 years before the war that would reshape his country and his world. His father was a minor Communist Party official, loyal but unremarkable, the kind of man who survived Stalin's purges through sheer bureaucratic invisibility. Young Yuri showed an early aptitude for languages. By 15, he was reading English novels in their original form. By 18, he'd caught the attention of a KGB recruiter who recognized in him something rare: the ability to disappear into another culture without losing operational discipline. The training was relentless. 3 years at the Red Banner Institute, where he learned not just to speak English, but to think in English, to dream in English. He studied American history more thoroughly than most Americans. He memorized baseball statistics, learned to appreciate jazz, practiced the casual body language of confidence that Americans wore like a second skin. He spent 6 months in East Berlin, testing his cover story on Western diplomats and journalists, refining his accent, smoothing the rough edges of his fabricated identity. The KGB was preparing him for deep cover, the kind of assignment that could last years, even decades. By the time Yuri Loganov arrived in McLean, Virginia, in the spring of 1978, he was no longer entirely Russian. Some essential part of him had been erased and rewritten. He had become a man without a country, serving a system he believed in less with each passing year, but serving it nonetheless because he didn't know how to be anything else. The ideology that had once burned bright in his youth had faded to the dull glow of habit. What remained was duty, discipline, and the growing sense that he was living inside a performance that would never end. His neighbors didn't see any of that. They saw a polite professor with kind eyes who knew an impressive amount about Russian literature and seemed genuinely interested in their lives. Within 2 weeks, Yuri Loganov had become part of the neighborhood fabric. He joined the weekend gardening crew that gathered each Saturday morning to trade advice about mulch and aphids. He attended a 4th of July barbecue where he ate hamburgers and pretended to understand the rules of horseshoes. He helped his neighbor Jim Patterson fix a broken lawnmower, demonstrating a working knowledge of small engines that surprised everyone. When asked where he'd learned such practical skills, Yuri smiled and said his father had been a mechanic. It was a lie, but it was the kind of comfortable lie that made people feel they understood him. The real work happened at night, after the children were asleep and the street had gone quiet. Yuri would climb the stairs to the master bedroom, where Irina had set up what appeared to be a small reading nook by the window. A comfortable chair, a lamp, shelves lined with Russian and English literature. Hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of War and Peace was a modified Leica camera with a telephoto lens capable of capturing license plates from 3 miles away. Yuri would sit in that chair for hours, watching the entrance to CIA headquarters through the darkness, photographing every vehicle that passed beneath the floodlights. He noted patterns. The early arrivals, analysts and case officers who came in before dawn, carrying briefcases and coffee cups, the ones who bore the weight of ongoing operations. The late departures, senior officials whose cars idled at the gate while security guards checked credentials with unusual care. He memorized faces, matched them to vehicles, built a mental database of routines and deviations. Moscow Center wanted intelligence, and intelligence began with observation. Know who works there. Know when they arrive and when they leave. Know who looks stressed, who looks confident, who might be vulnerable to approach. Irina managed the communications. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she would descend to the basement with a transistor radio, ostensibly to listen to classical music while she did laundry. The radio had been modified to receive shortwave transmissions on frequencies that appeared to be nothing but static. Inside that static were coded messages from Soviet handlers, instructions, requests for specific information, warnings about FBI counterintelligence activity. Irina would decode the messages using a one-time pad hidden inside a cookbook, transcribe them onto water-soluble paper, and present them to Yuri before destroying the evidence. Their responses went out through a different channel. Dead drops in Rock Creek Park, messages hidden inside library books, occasionally encrypted letters mailed to addresses in Canada that would be forwarded through a network of intermediaries back to Moscow. It was exhausting work, and it was lonely. They couldn't talk about it with each other except in whispers, and even then, only when they were certain the house was secure. They couldn't share the burden with anyone. Every conversation with a neighbor was a performance. Every friendship was tactical. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the performance began to wear on them both. The turning point came in the form of Robert Caldwell, who lived 4 houses down in a split-level ranch he'd bought before his divorce. Caldwell was a CIA analyst specializing in Soviet economic policy, a mid-level position that granted him access to classified material but kept him far from operational decision-making. He was 43 years old, graying at the temples, with the slightly rumpled appearance of a man who'd stopped caring about impressions after his wife left. He spent his evenings alone, reading on his back porch with a glass of scotch, and he radiated a particular species of American loneliness that Yuri recognized immediately. They met at a neighborhood association meeting about street repairs. Caldwell mentioned he'd been trying to read Solzhenitsyn, but was struggling with the translation. Yuri offered to lend him a better edition, and Caldwell accepted with the grateful eagerness of someone starved for intellectual conversation. The next evening, Yuri appeared at Caldwell's door with a worn copy of The First Circle and a bottle of decent vodka. They sat on the porch and talked about Russian literature until midnight. It became a ritual. 2 or 3 times a week, Caldwell would walk over to Yuri's house, or Yuri would visit Caldwell's porch, and they would discuss Dostoevsky's theology, Tolstoy's contradictions, Chekhov's quiet despair. Caldwell was brilliant in the way of men who'd spent their careers analyzing systems rather than living inside them. He understood the Soviet economy better than most Russians, but he'd never felt the weight of it, the suffocating inevitability of a system designed to grind individual will into collective obedience. Yuri found himself speaking with unexpected honesty during these conversations. Not about his mission, never about his real identity, but about the ideas themselves, about the gap between ideology and human experience, about the cost of living according to principles that demanded the erasure of self. And Caldwell, lonely and brilliant and starved for connection, began to trust him completely. By the autumn of 1979, Yuri Loganov had been living in McLean for 18 months. The garden he'd planted that first spring had flourished. Tomatoes, cucumbers, a row of herbs along the back fence. His daughter had made the honor roll at her elementary school. His son had joined a soccer team. Irina had formed a cautious friendship with 2 other mothers on the street, women who invited her to book clubs and afternoon coffee. The Loganovs had become, by all appearances, exactly what they pretended to be: a quiet immigrant family pursuing the modest American dream. But the intelligence work had intensified. Moscow Center was no longer satisfied with surveillance photographs and routine observations. They wanted actionable intelligence, specific information about CIA operations, personnel vulnerabilities, ongoing investigations into Soviet networks. The coded messages that arrived through Irina's shortwave radio grew more insistent, more demanding. Moscow wanted results that justified the enormous risk of maintaining an asset so close to enemy headquarters. Yuri felt the pressure like a physical weight. He'd been trained for this, prepared for exactly this scenario, but the reality of it was different from the training. In training, the targets were abstractions, names on paper, photographs of strangers, hypothetical scenarios played out in sanitized conference rooms. Here, the targets had faces. They had families. They waved to him from their driveways, and one of them had become something that made Yuri's mission infinitely more complicated: a friend. Robert Caldwell had no idea he was being cultivated. To him, Yuri was simply a fellow intellectual, someone who understood that literature wasn't decoration, but a way of making sense of existence. Their conversations had deepened over the months, moving beyond books into philosophy, politics, the nature of loyalty and conscience. Caldwell spoke with surprising candor about his work. Not classified details, but context, the bureaucratic frustrations, the ideological debates within the agency about how to interpret Soviet intentions. He complained about colleagues who saw the world in black and white, who couldn't understand that most people, even in authoritarian systems, We're just trying to survive, not conquer the world. We spend so much time analyzing them," Caldwell said one evening, gesturing vaguely eastward with his Scotch glass, "that we forget they're analyzing us too. It's like two chess players who've studied each other so long they've started to think alike. Makes you wonder what we're even fighting about anymore." Yuri had frozen at those words, the glass of vodka suspended halfway to his lips. It was the kind of disillusionment Moscow looked for, the crack in ideological certainty that could be widened into betrayal. But hearing it from Caldwell, from this lonely, brilliant man who trusted him, Yuri felt something unexpected. Revulsion, not at Caldwell's doubt, but at his own mission, at the mechanism of exploitation he was part of, at the system that had sent him here to transform friendship into a weapon. He'd made a decision that night, though he didn't consciously recognize it as such. He would give Moscow something, enough to satisfy them, enough to keep his cover intact. But he would not give them Caldwell. He would not be the instrument of his friend's destruction. The compromise came in the form of unclassified information that Caldwell mentioned casually. Budget allocation discussions, personnel reassignments, the kind of administrative minutiae that revealed organizational priorities without exposing specific operations. Yuri photographed documents from his own university office, material that technically dealt with Soviet studies, but could be presented to Moscow as intelligence gathered through his CIA contact. It was a dangerous game, one that required him to deceive both his handlers and his target simultaneously. But it bought him time. It allowed him to maintain the fiction that he was still operational while protecting the one genuine human connection he'd formed in 2 years of performance. Irina noticed the change in him. She said nothing directly. Their cover didn't allow for such conversations inside the house, but her glances carried questions. Why was he taking fewer photographs? Why were his reports to Moscow so thin? She was a loyal KGB officer, perhaps more loyal than Yuri himself, and she understood that sentiment was the enemy of operational security. But she also understood her husband well enough to recognize when he was approaching some internal crisis. Then, in November 1979, everything shifted. A Soviet defector arrived in Washington, a mid-level KGB officer who'd worked in the directorate responsible for illegal operations in North America. His debriefing was incomplete, his information fragmentary, but he mentioned something that made counterintelligence officers at both the FBI and CIA sit up sharply. A sleeper house, somewhere in the Virginia suburbs, positioned for surveillance of a major intelligence facility. No names, no specific location, just enough to trigger a systematic review of every foreign national living within a 10-mile radius of CIA headquarters. The net was closing. Yuri received the warning from Moscow Center on a cold Tuesday evening in late November. The coded message was brief: heightened scrutiny, reduce activity, prepare evacuation protocol, which meant stop all operations, maintain cover, wait for instructions to flee. The FBI surveillance began subtly. Yuri spotted it within days. A utility van parked on the street that never seemed to move. License plates that appeared too frequently in his rearview mirror. A man in a business suit reading a newspaper at the coffee shop where Yuri bought his morning paper, the same newspaper held at the same angle 3 days in a row. These were good agents, well-trained, but Yuri had been taught to recognize surveillance by some of the best instructors in the Soviet Union. He knew what to look for. More importantly, he knew what it meant. They didn't have enough yet. If they had concrete evidence, they would have arrested him already. The FBI was watching, waiting for him to make contact with a handler, to service a dead drop, to do something that would give them prosecutable proof. The smart move was to freeze, to become exactly what his cover identity claimed to be: a literature professor living a quiet suburban life, waiting for the surveillance to exhaust itself or for Moscow to extract him. But Moscow Center had other ideas. The messages arriving through Irina's shortwave radio grew more urgent, more demanding. They wanted results. They'd invested years in establishing Yuri's cover, positioned him in an impossibly valuable location. And now, with the operation potentially compromised, they wanted a final intelligence haul before extraction. They wanted him to take risks precisely when risk was most dangerous. Yuri and Irina argued about it in whispers, late at night, using a noise generator they'd hidden inside a bedroom fan to mask their conversation from potential listening devices. Irina's position was clear. They were officers of the KGB, they had sworn oaths, they would follow orders. If Moscow wanted intelligence, they would provide it. If Moscow ordered extraction, they would extract. Personal feelings were irrelevant. The mission was everything. But Yuri had begun to question the mission itself, not the ideology. He'd stopped believing in that years ago, but the fundamental assumption that his life belonged to the state, that his choices were not his own, that conscience was a luxury reserved for people who didn't carry secrets. He'd spent 2 years building relationships with his neighbors, genuinely caring for his garden, helping fix lawnmowers, and discussing literature on suburban porches. And somewhere in that performance, the performance had stopped being a performance. He'd become the person he was pretending to be. "What if I don't want to leave?" he said one night, the words barely audible over the mechanical hum of the fan. Irina stared at him with something between disbelief and fear. "You're not serious." "I've never been more serious in my life. Yuri, we have children. If we're arrested, if we run, they'll know we were guilty. They'll prosecute us in absentia, put us on trial in the newspapers, use us as propaganda. Our children will grow up in Moscow with that stain, the children of traitors who fled. But if we stay, if we become what we've been pretending to be, you're talking about defection." Irina's voice was flat, emotionless, but Yuri could see the fear behind her eyes. He didn't answer immediately. Defection. The word carried such weight, such finality. It meant betraying everything he'd been trained to serve, everyone who'd trusted him, the entire apparatus that had shaped his adult life. But it also meant something else. Freedom, the chance to live according to his own conscience, rather than someone else's orders. The chance for his children to grow up without the suffocating weight of state surveillance, without the constant fear that defined Soviet life. Before he could respond, everything changed again. Robert Caldwell called him one evening in early December. His voice on the phone was different, careful, measured, with an edge of something Yuri couldn't quite identify. Hurt, perhaps, or betrayal. "Yuri, we need to talk. Can you come over?" Yuri's training kicked in immediately. Every instinct screamed danger. But this was Caldwell, his friend, and something in that careful voice demanded honesty. "Of course, give me 10 minutes. He walked to Caldwell's house through the December darkness, his breath visible in the cold air, his mind racing through possibilities. What did Caldwell know? What had he been told? The FBI might have warned him, might have shown him photographs, might have explained that his neighbor, his friend, his conversation partner for 18 months, was a Soviet intelligence officer. Caldwell opened the door and stepped aside without a word. His face was composed, but his eyes carried the unmistakable weight of someone who'd just discovered a profound betrayal. They sat on the porch despite the cold, 2 men who'd shared countless evenings in this exact spot, now separated by a chasm neither had acknowledged until this moment. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Caldwell spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "Yuri, who are you really?" It was the question Yuri had been dreading for 2 years. The question he'd rehearsed answers for, deflections, cover stories that would maintain his identity and protect his mission. But sitting there, looking at his friend's face, seeing the genuine pain of betrayed trust, Yuri found he couldn't lie anymore. Yuri looked at Robert Caldwell and felt something inside him break. Not the way glass shatters, but the way ice cracks under pressure, slow and inevitable. He could have lied. The training was there, buried deep in his reflexes, ready to deploy another layer of deception. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he heard himself say something he'd never said to anyone outside the KGB. "I am someone who understands what it costs to serve an empire that does not care whether you live or die." It wasn't a confession. Not technically. But it was the closest thing to truth Yuri had spoken since arriving in McLean. Caldwell's face registered the weight of those words. The careful non-denial. the admission hidden inside ambiguity. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected, but hadn't wanted to believe. "The FBI came to see me yesterday," Caldwell said. "They asked questions about you, about our conversations, about what I might have told you." He paused, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. "I told them you were a literature professor, that we talked about books, that I'd never discussed classified material with you, all of which is true." "Robert, let me finish." Caldwell's voice was firm but not angry. "I told them the truth because it was the truth, but I also told them something else. I said that if you were what they suspected, you were the worst intelligence officer I'd ever heard of, because you'd had 18 months to exploit me, and you'd chosen to discuss Dostoevsky instead." Yuri felt something twist in his chest. "You defended me. I defended my friend. I don't know if those are the same person anymore." Caldwell stood, walked to the porch railing, looked out at the quiet street where Christmas lights had begun appearing on houses. "The FBI agent told me to stop all contact with you, to report any attempt you made to reach me. He said I'd been targeted for recruitment and didn't realize it." "And what did you say?" "I told him I'd think about it." Caldwell turned back to face him. "But I want to hear it from you, Yuri. Not some careful non-answer. I want to know, was any of it real? The conversations, the friendship, the late nights arguing about whether Raskolnikov could ever be redeemed? Was any of that real? Or was I just a target the whole time?" The question hung between them in the cold December air. Yuri could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. Moscow's demands, the FBI's surveillance, Irina's fear, his children's future, the entire architecture of lies he'd built and lived inside for years. But beneath all of that was something simpler, something that felt like truth. "It started as a mission," Yuri said quietly. "You were exactly the kind of person Moscow trains us to identify. Intelligent, isolated, ideologically uncertain. Everything I did in the beginning was tactical. But somewhere along the way, something changed. You weren't a target anymore. You were my friend. And I realized that the man I was pretending to be, the literature professor who cared more about Chekhov than politics, that man was more real than the officer who'd been sent to betray you." Caldwell studied his face for a long moment. "So what happens now?" "I don't know." And it was the truth. For the first time in his operational career, Yuri genuinely didn't know what came next. Moscow wanted him to continue gathering intelligence, or evacuate. The FBI wanted him to make a mistake they could prosecute. Irina wanted him to follow orders and protect their family. But none of those futures felt like his own anymore. "There's a third option," Caldwell said carefully. "You know what it is. I can't suggest it, can't encourage it, can't be part of that decision, but you're smart enough to know it exists. Defection." The word hung unspoken between them. Caldwell was offering him something. Not quite help, not quite encouragement, but acknowledgement. Recognition that Yuri had a choice, that he wasn't simply a chess piece moved by forces beyond his control. "If I did that," Yuri said slowly, "everything I was would be erased. My country, my career, my identity, everything. Or," Caldwell said gently, "everything you've pretended to be would finally become real." They sat in silence after that, two men on a suburban porch in December, separated by ideology and loyalty and duty, but connected by something that neither empire had accounted for in its calculations. Genuine human regard. The kind of friendship that couldn't be weaponized or exploited because it existed outside the logic of intelligence operations, in some space where conscience still mattered more than orders. Yuri walked home that night knowing what he had to do. The decision had already been made. Really, made in all those conversations about literature and morality. Made in the garden he'd planted and tended. Made in the moment he'd chosen to protect Caldwell rather than exploit him. Now he just had to find the courage to act on it. He found Irina in the kitchen, pretending to read but clearly waiting for him. Before she could speak, before she could ask what had happened, Yuri said the words that would change everything. "I'm going to contact the FBI. I'm going to offer them everything."